It's California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance, and we are joined by Karthick Ramakrishnan. He is now an associate dean at UC Riverside in the new School of Public Policy, also on the API Commission for the state of California, and a general expert in Asian American politics. There's so many things to talk about, but let's start with the definition of Asian Americans, and how that definition is now being reevaluated. Talk to us about it, sir.
So the key thing about Asian Americans is that it's a racial category,
Right.
and in many ways it's a construct. It's something that's evolved over time, but it's something that's uniquely American. Only in the United States do you have people from as far away, from Japan all the way over to Pakistan, all in the same category.
And you mentioned Pakistan because when I think of Asian Americans, I think of individuals with beautiful almond-shaped eyes. But that would only be those of East Asia. That's
Right.
China, Japan, Korea, Pakistan, India.
And they're considered within the Asian American category. And importantly, people who come from other parts of Asia, like Afghanistan or Iran, are not considered Asian American. In fact, the Census Bureau is evaluating a new category for 2020 called Middle Eastern and North African, where some of those groups might be.
So let's go back to what we define as Asian American classically. Sure. There's so many subgroups within that category. There are Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Indian Americans, Filipinos, and all with very different viewpoints and perspectives.
Well, it's important to recognize that while you have the same racial category, and in fact there's a fair amount of similarity, especially if you look politically in the last 20 years, there's been a general drift towards the Democratic Party.
Which we'll talk about soon.
Yes, and also, generally speaking, strong support for universal health care or the Affordable Care Act. But there are differences, especially when it comes to educational attainment, income, big disparities. So generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, people who are here from Southeast Asia, especially refugee populations, tend to have much lower educational attainment. They came out of war-torn regions, and they're not doing as well in terms of income and wealth as Indian Americans are doing or Chinese Americans are doing.
Japanese Americans as well.
Yes. Yes.
So now in the California legislature, there's a bill that's pending by Assemblyman Rob Bonta, who is of Filipino descent,
Yes,
I
he
think
is.
so.
Yes.
And he's looking at whether we need to disaggregate that definition and create more subcategories partially because of what you've described.
Right, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, we have this kind of disaggregation. Disaggregation is just a fancy way of saying separating out the group.
Right.
And we already have that when it comes to census data at the federal level, but we don't have it at the state level on important outcomes like education. So how many Cambodians are there in the Cal State system or in the community college system? We just don't know the answer.
And it's fascinating you say that because we know that we see, in the major newspapers, there'll be a chart, every April, right after admissions letters have come out saying, UCLA is this number of Caucasians or Anglos or Latinos or Asian Americans. And Asian American numbers have been growing at the UC system. But yet, it tends to be from one group of Asians, mostly Chinese Americans. Is that fair?
Mostly Chinese Americans. Well, so you have Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, and Indian Americans tending to do relatively well in the UC system. And that was one of the things that happened with the debate last year is that
on
we just
SB 5.
On SCA 5,
SCA 5, thank you.
The Senate Constitution Amendment 5, that generally we just talked about it as an Asian category, but there's big differences. And we didn't talk about Filipinos, which are one of the largest Asian groups in the state, and they're not doing as well as Chinese Americans.
And that debate over SCA 5 was whether to take another look at Prop 187. Or 209?
Prop 209, affirmative action.
Prop 209. And ultimately, you saw large groups of Chinese Americans coming out against reevaluating 209.
Yes.
Whereas some other Asian American groups were in favor of it.
Yes, you had many Southeast Asian groups that were in favor of basically not just relying on our current system, but to think about particularly disadvantaged groups, and especially if you're talking about Hmong, Cambodian, Laotians, and they're a sizable number in California, and they're not being served by the current system that we have.
I want to talk about one group of Asian Americans that has done very well in California politics, and that's female Asian Americans in the November 2014 election. In that election, 3 Republican Asian American women went to Sacramento. Young Kim, a Korean American, Ling Ling Chang, a Taiwanese American, Janet Nguyen, a Vietnamese American. I believe that all three of them were groundbreakers. They were the first of their category. What I found interesting about those three is they're all Republicans.
Right.
Whereas, as you indicated earlier, sir, the Asian American community had been trending Democratic.
Yeah.
Is it still, or is this just kind of...
It's a little too early to tell. In fact, one of the big debates that happened after the midterm elections was you had two different polls coming out. I wasn't affiliated with either of them, but that seemed to point in different directions. One seemed to indicate a pretty dramatic shift, whereas another one did not indicate a dramatic shift. And it's difficult to say because midterm election, first of all, turnout was so low, right? So we don't know if it's actually people changing their mind. More likely it is that certain groups were much more energized and enthusiastic about the election, and they came out. But I think it'll be important going forward because one of the probably one of the few viable strategies for the Republican Party to grow in California is to reach out to Asian Americans, but also to run candidates of diverse backgrounds. Because if they don't do that, it's going to be very difficult for them to get anywhere close to where they were before.
Let's talk about another candidate who's quite diverse. She is currently the Attorney General of the state of California. She had been District Attorney for San Francisco. Her name is Kamala Harris. She had a very tough race when she ran the first time. She won in a recount. She was reelected overwhelmingly in 2014. It's hard to deny that she's a front-runner for Barbara Boxer's Senate seat in 2016, a Democrat. She is of African-American and Indian-American descent.
Right, and that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. In fact, I have a graduate student who studies multiracial candidates and how they portray themselves, how the media portray them. And this will also be relevant in terms of their fundraising strategies, right? And so she can count not only on African-American support, but also Indian-American support. And this also brings into interesting relief kind of the Northern California versus Southern California dimension. So there's a lot of interest, especially among Southern California politicians, especially among Latino elected officials, to figure out if there's some room for them to maneuver in there. But the window seems to be closing pretty quickly.
So I think, the most well-known multiracial candidate would be Barack Obama. He is multiracial. He has an Anglo mother, an African father. It seems as if he was running as an African-American, no? I mean, what did your student tell us? What did he learn?
Well, the thing, she. So
what did she learn?
I mean, so if you look at Obama, even in the course of the campaign, initially the debate was he black enough?
Enough, right.
And that he was actually a son of an immigrant, so he doesn't know the black experience.
Right, because his father was Kenyan.
And then it shifted pretty dramatically through the South Carolina primaries and afterwards. But here what you see is, especially in the case of Kamala Harris, she'll get coverage not only she's a superstar regardless, but she'll be covered in a certain way in the African American media and covered in a different way in the Indian American media.
So what have you seen so far? Because, look, my perception is those that are ethnically ambiguous in politics, it's almost as if they are considered Anglo. I know maybe that's naive, but people aren't really sure what to make of them, so they just kind of, we'll treat them like Europeans.
Well, I think it's a little different, actually. So in the case of Kamala Harris, I think she is emblematic of the future of California, right? You have a lot of mixed race, people in California, a lot of multiracial. California has higher than average in terms of multiracial couples, and people who identify as multiracial. So in many ways, I think it's not to say that California is indicative of a post-racial society, but I think the categories are changing, and California is taking the lead on
As someone who is tied into the Indian American community, is there a certain pride right now that Kamala Harris appears to be on her way?
Absolutely, and what I see is that she was involved in Barack Obama's campaign, and she was involved not only in African American affinity groups, but also South Asian affinity groups.
You got to come back.
Yeah.
His name is Karthick Ramakrishnan. He is an associate dean at UC Riverside. My name is Brad Pomerance. It's California Edition.